You're standing in a valley right now. The wind is cold against your face. You look down, and beneath your feet, there's something half buried in the mud. You bend down and pull it free. It's a letter. The ink is faded, the paper stained with dried blood. You unfold it carefully. It reads, "My beloved, if you receive this, know that I fought not for glory, but so you would never have to." The letter ends there, unfinished, because the man who wrote it never made it home. His body lies somewhere in this valley, mixed with thousands of others, forgotten by time, but not by the earth. This is not just history. This is the price of pride, of miscommunication, of two kingdoms so determined to destroy each other that they succeeded completely. And if you scroll past this story, you're walking over their graves without a second thought. They died believing someone would remember. So subscribe, not for me, but for them, because their story deserves to be told, and you're the only one left to hear it. The year was 1260. The place, a narrow valley trapped between two mountain ridges in what is now modern-day Anatolia. The valley had no name then. It would earn one later. They would call it the Valley of Bones. Not because of legend, not because of myth, but because of what happened there over the course of a single, blood-soaked day. Two kingdoms stood on the brink of this valley. On one side, the forces of the Sultanate of Rum, a fractured but still formidable remnant of the Seljuk Empire. On the other, the army of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol Empire's western branch, fresh from their devastating campaigns across Persia and eager to expand further into Anatolia. Neither side was weak. Neither side was unprepared. But both sides were about to make the same fatal mistake. They underestimated the valley itself. The Sultanate of Rum was a shadow of its former self. Once a powerful empire that controlled vast stretches of Anatolia, it had been fractured by internal strife, rebellions, and the relentless pressure of the Mongol invasions. But the Sultan, a man named Rukn al-Din Kilij Arslan IV, refused to surrender. He gathered what remained of his forces, around 40,000 men, a mix of Turkish cavalry, Armenian auxiliaries, and local militias. They were not the elite warriors of old, but they were determined. They had families behind them, cities that depended on their victory, and they carried with them the weight of a dying empire's last hope. Across the valley, the Mongol commander, a general named Beiju Noyan, surveyed his own forces. 60,000 men, hardened by decades of conquest, experts in rapid cavalry maneuvers, psychological warfare, and the brutal efficiency that had made the Mongol Empire the largest the world had ever seen. Beiju had crushed armies twice the size of the Sultan's forces. He expected this to be no different. A quick engagement, a decisive victory, another notch in the long list of Mongol triumphs. But the valley had other plans. It was narrow, barely 3 miles wide at its broadest point, and flanked on both sides by steep, rocky ridges. The ground was uneven, dotted with boulders and patches of loose gravel that made footing treacherous. A small river ran through the center, its waters shallow but its banks muddy and unstable. For cavalry, the backbone of both armies, it was a nightmare. Any general with experience would have avoided it. But neither side could afford to wait. The Sultan needed a victory to rally his fractured kingdom. Beiju needed to crush the Sultan quickly before reinforcements could arrive. So both armies entered the valley, and neither would leave it intact. The battle began at dawn. The Mongols struck first, sending wave after wave of light cavalry down the valley in their signature feint-and-retreat tactic. The goal was simple: draw the Sultan's forces into disarray, then strike with the heavy cavalry once the enemy lines broke. It was a tactic that had worked 1,000 times before. But the valley's terrain disrupted everything. The narrow space meant the Mongol cavalry couldn't spread out, couldn't maneuver with their usual fluidity. They crashed into the Sultan's front lines in tight, chaotic clusters, their speed and precision neutralized by the cramped conditions. The Sultan's forces, for their part, held firm. Their infantry, packed tightly together, formed a wall of shields and spears that the Mongol light cavalry struggled to penetrate. For the first time in years, the Sultan's army felt hope. They were holding. They were pushing back. But that hope was built on a fragile foundation. The Mongols regrouped. Beiju, recognizing that his light cavalry was ineffective, ordered his heavy cavalry forward. These were not the swift, hit-and-run warriors of the steppes. These were armored lancers, men and horses clad in thick plates of iron, designed to smash through enemy lines with sheer force. They thundered down the valley, a wall of metal and muscle, and when they hit the Sultan's lines, the impact was devastating. Men were crushed beneath hooves. Shields splintered. Spears snapped. The front line crumbled, and the Mongol heavy cavalry pushed deep into the Sultan's formation. For a moment, it seemed the battle was over. The Sultan's army was breaking. Soldiers were scattering. Panic was spreading. But then something unexpected happened. The river, the small, unassuming river that ran through the center of the valley, became a trap. The Mongol heavy cavalry, in their momentum, pushed too far. They reached the riverbank, and the muddy, unstable ground gave way beneath the weight of their armor. Horses stumbled. Riders fell. The tightly packed cavalry formation ground to a halt, stuck in the mud, unable to advance or retreat. And the Sultan's forces, seeing the enemy falter, rallied. The Armenian auxiliaries, lightly armored and mobile, rushed forward. They surrounded the stuck cavalry, pulling riders from their horses, stabbing at the gaps in their armor. The Mongols, so used to being the predators, suddenly found themselves the prey. The heavy cavalry was slaughtered, not in a glorious charge, not in a heroic last stand, but slowly, methodically, as they struggled helplessly in the mud. Beiju watched from the ridge, his face unreadable. He had lost nearly a third of his heavy cavalry in minutes. But he was not done. He ordered the archers forward. 10,000 Mongol archers, the finest in the world, lined the ridges on both sides of the valley. And then, at his signal, they fired. The sky went dark, not with clouds, but with arrows. Tens of thousands of them, raining down on the Sultan's forces like a storm of iron. There was no cover in the valley, no shelter. The arrows punched through shields, through armor, through flesh. Men fell by the hundreds, by the thousands. The Sultan's forces, who moments ago had been celebrating their victory over the heavy cavalry, were now being massacred from above. They tried to retreat, but the narrow valley worked against them. They were packed too tightly. Every arrow that missed its target found another. The Sultan, watching his army dissolve under the hail of arrows, made a desperate decision. He ordered a full cavalry charge. Every mounted soldier he had left, nearly 5,000 men, would charge directly at the Mongol archers on the ridges. It was a suicide mission. The slopes were steep, the footing unstable, and the archers would cut them down long before they reached the top. But the Sultan had no other choice. If his army stayed in the valley, they would be annihilated. So the cavalry charged. They rode up the slopes, their horses struggling against the loose gravel, their bodies exposed to the relentless barrage of arrows. Hundreds fell in the first minute, hundreds more in the second, but a few, through sheer luck or determination, made it to the top. And when they did, they crashed into the Mongol archers with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. The archers, trained for ranged combat, were no match for armored cavalry in close quarters. They were cut down, their bows useless at such close range. The Sultan's cavalry pushed forward, clearing sections of the ridge, buying their comrades below a few precious moments of respite. But it was not enough. Beiju, seeing his archers faltering, sent his reserve forces, another wave of light cavalry, to retake the ridges. The two forces collided on the narrow slopes, and the ridge became a meat grinder. Men and horses tumbled down the steep incline, their bodies broken on the rocks below. The fighting was no longer organized. There were no formations, no strategies. It was chaos, pure, brutal chaos. By midday, both armies were shattered. The Sultan's forces, reduced to less than half their original strength, huddled in the center of the valley, surrounded by the bodies of their dead. The Mongol forces, having lost their heavy cavalry and a significant portion of their archers, clung to the ridges, unable to press their advantage. Neither side had won, but both had lost catastrophically. And then the real tragedy began. Miscommunication. A commander on the Sultan's side, thinking he saw a retreat order, pulled his forces back toward the southern end of the valley. Another commander, seeing the first group retreat, assumed they had been routed and ordered his own forces to fall back as well. Within minutes, what little cohesion remained in the Sultan's army collapsed. Soldiers fled in every direction, not because they were being pursued, but because they thought everyone else was fleeing. The Mongols, seeing the Sultan's forces scatter, assumed they were launching a flanking maneuver. Beiju, paranoid and exhausted, ordered a full retreat to the northern ridges to regroup and reassess. But his subordinates, misinterpreting the order, thought they were retreating from the battlefield entirely. Units began pulling back in disarray, abandoning their positions, leaving gaps in the Mongol lines. And in the chaos, neither side realized the other was just as broken. By late afternoon, the valley was a graveyard. But the fighting was not over. Small skirmishes continued as scattered groups of soldiers, cut off from their commanders, stumbled into each other in the dim light. There was no strategy anymore. No objectives. Just exhausted, terrified men killing each other because they didn't know what else to do. As night fell, the valley grew silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of death. The survivors, on both sides, collapsed where they stood. Too tired to fight. Too tired to run. Too tired to even care anymore. The Sultan's army, once 40,000 strong, had been reduced to fewer than 8,000. The Mongol forces, once 60,000, had lost nearly 30,000 men. Neither side had the strength to launch another attack. Neither side had the will. And so the valley, still littered with the bodies of the dead and dying, simply stopped. There was no victory, no surrender, no retreat, just silence. When dawn broke the next morning, the survivors began to move. The Sultan's remaining forces, leaderless and broken, scattered into the countryside, dissolving into the hills and villages of Anatolia. Many would never return home. The Mongols, though technically in control of the battlefield, were too devastated to pursue. Beiju, staring at the carnage below, made the decision to withdraw. There was nothing left to conquer here. No glory to claim. Just a valley full of bones. The Sultan himself did not survive the battle. Some accounts say he was killed in the cavalry charge. Others say he died later, from wounds sustained in the fighting. His body was never found. Neither were the bodies of most of the men who fought that day. The valley, inaccessible and remote, became a mass grave. For years afterward, travelers would avoid it, claiming they could hear the echoes of the battle in the wind, the cries of the dying still trapped in the air. The Valley of Bones changed nothing. The Sultanate of Rum continued its slow collapse, eventually absorbed entirely by the Mongols. The Ilkhanate continued its expansion, though it would face its own internal struggles in the years to come. The battle had no strategic impact, no shifting of borders, no change in the balance of power. It was, in the grand scope of history, meaningless, except to the men who fought there, except to the families who waited for soldiers who would never return, except to the villages that lost entire generations in a single day. For them, the Valley of Bones was everything. And yet, history barely remembers it. There are no grand monuments, no epic poems, no paintings depicting the heroism of the soldiers. Because there was no heroism. Just two armies, trapped in a valley, destroying each other over a conflict that neither side truly understood. The valley itself still exists. It has a name now, though it's not the Valley of Bones anymore. Locals call it something else, something softer, something that doesn't carry the weight of what happened there. But if you walk through it, especially in the early morning when the mist clings to the ground, you can still feel it. The weight of all those lives. The silence of all those voices. The earth remembers, even if we don't. War is often romanticized. We talk about the glory, the strategy, the heroes. But the Valley of Bones is a reminder of the other side. The side where there are no heroes. No glory. Just men, killing and dying, because someone, somewhere, decided it had to be done. And when it was over, nothing had changed. Nothing had been gained. Nothing had been won. Just a valley full of bones. And a question that still lingers in the wind. Why?